Tonight, we're venturing back into that deeply peculiar realm of the Middle Ages, a time when the laws were brutally strict, fashion choices carried real consequences, and bread had the power to send you to prison. Before settling in, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, but genuinely, only if you actually enjoy what happens here. That way, I know my rambling about medieval oddities isn't just disappearing into the void. Drop your location and current time in the comments, too. There's something oddly satisfying about knowing who's listening to obscure history from across the globe at 3 in the morning. So dim those lights, maybe get a fan running for some background white noise, and let's ease into this strange journey together. The color that could cost you, purple and the Sumptu Laws. Let's start with something deceptively simple, the color purple. Sounds innocent enough, right? It's just a shade. It shows up on yoga mats today, on those plastic grapes nobody buys, on the occasional bruise, but in medieval Europe, wearing purple without the proper social credentials wasn't just frowned upon, it could literally get you arrested. The reason behind this particular obsession wasn't about aesthetics or personal preference, it was purely economic, which somehow makes it even weirder. You see, purple dye in the medieval world wasn't just expensive, it existed in a category of its own, ridiculously, absurdly, almost incomprehensibly rare. This wasn't purple from plants or minerals or anything straightforward like that. The most prized purple came from the mucus of tiny sea snails, a grueling process that required literally thousands of these mollusks just to produce enough dye to color a single piece of fabric. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of snails, each one contributing just a microscopic amount of its mucus, all of it smelling absolutely terrible, taking forever to process. And the final result was often just a muddy plum color if you didn't get the formula exactly right. But when you did get it right, when you achieved that true Tyrian purple, it became a color so associated with power and wealth that the elite decided nobody else should have it. So the laws came. These were called Sumptu Laws, legal codes specifically designed to reinforce social hierarchies by controlling what people could wear, what fabrics they could use, what colors their clothes could be, and in some cases, what they were permitted to say. If you were a blacksmith, brown was your color. A merchant doing moderately well? Maybe you could get away with dark green. Purple? That was exclusively for royalty, bishops, and the sorts of people who had literally been stamped with God's approval as part of their job description. Wearing purple without authorization wasn't just socially awkward. It could result in serious fines, public humiliation, and, in extreme cases, much worse. And this punishment didn't stop at the person wearing the illegal garment. Tailors who dared to stitch purple fabric for commoners could be punished too. They were participants in the crime of unauthorized dressing. The restrictions didn't stop at purple either. The laws branched out into other materials and colors with alarming specificity. Silk was regulated. Fur was regulated. Gold embroidery was absolutely out of the question for anyone below a certain rank. One particularly aggressive English law even prohibited common people from wearing clothes with too many buttons, since excessive buttons were apparently the height of flamboyance and clearly above someone's station. Imagine living in a time when the number of buttons on your tunic could get you in legal trouble. If you were a peasant wearing something with extra decorative flair, you might as well have shown up to church in full royal regalia. The authorities would view you with the same suspicion. Interestingly, some of the most famous rebels of the era actively broke these fashion laws on purpose, using their clothing as a subtle flex. Take Edward IV of England, who wore Italian-inspired velvet and fur-lined capes that directly violated the laws he himself helped create. It was like writing parking tickets all day and then double parking your gold carriage outside the castle just for fun. And people definitely noticed. Breaking fashion laws became a way to signal wealth and influence, a dangerous game of staying just on the edge of what was legally acceptable while making it clear you didn't really care about the rules. Now, scholars endlessly debate how seriously these laws were actually enforced. Some argue they were mostly symbolic, designed more to remind people of their place than to actively punish individuals. Others point to extensive court records filled with fines and penalties, suggesting enforcement was quite real and often harsh. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. In large cities, where the elite were feeling especially paranoid about social disorder, you definitely didn't want to be caught in that purple hat. But out in the countryside where the local lord had bigger worries, wolves, poor harvests, that sort of thing, your fashion crimes might slide by with nothing more than a stern glance and a "don't do it again." Still, there's something genuinely strange about a system where your clothing was illegal depending on your social rank. Think about your closet right now. If that system existed today and your rank determined what you could wear, half of it would be contraband. That dyed shirt? Criminal. Any synthetic fabric? Illegal. That logo you're wearing? Definitely grounds for arrest. That's what made the medieval system so perfectly, impossibly medieval. Clothes weren't just about utility or even fashion. They were identity. They told the world exactly who you were, where you stood in the hierarchy, and what laws applied to you. In a society obsessed with order and convinced that everything came down to divine right, messing with the structure of what someone wore was seen as a threat to something much bigger than fashion. It was a threat to God's plan. The bathing restrictions and medieval hygiene paranoia. Now, let's say you've managed to avoid the fashion police and kept your wardrobe strictly within legal bounds. You're ready to reward yourself with something nice, maybe a proper bath. But not so fast, because in many parts of medieval Europe there were specific days when bathing was basically illegal. Yes, you read that correctly. Not even kidding. Hygiene in the Middle Ages gets a lot of jokes today. People think medieval folks just never washed, that they were constantly filthy and reeking. But the reality was more complicated. Public bathhouses existed. Soap was a real product people used and traded. Most people genuinely did want to avoid smelling like a wet dog mixed with spoiled cabbage. The issue wasn't that bathing didn't exist. It was that a strange mixture of religious suspicion and public health paranoia created this murky, legal environment where cleanliness started to look morally questionable. Bathhouses, you see, had developed a certain reputation over the centuries. They were communal spaces, often co-ed, and in some cases they functioned as something between a community center and a barely supervised social club. Not all of them crossed that line, of course, but enough did that the church started getting very nervous. The institution began to view bathing with serious suspicion. Restrictions started appearing everywhere. Certain days of the week were declared off-limits for bathing. Specific hours were deemed inappropriate for a bath. In some places, entire classes of people, determined by gender or social status, were banned from bathing at all, or only allowed to do so under specific circumstances. Take France, for example. Some towns actively discouraged bathing on Wednesdays and Fridays because these were considered holy days meant for fasting and prayer. The logic was that you shouldn't be scrubbing your armpits in mixed company while you were supposed to be communing with God. It sounds absurd until you remember that medieval thinking tied everything back to spiritual implications. You weren't just cleaning your body. You were making a statement about your spiritual priorities. But it gets weirder. Medical beliefs of the time added another layer of weirdness to the whole situation. Doctors, or rather, people who thought they were doctors, genuinely believed that hot water could make you sick. Their logic went something like this. Hot water opens your pores, which then allows bad air, miasma, to get inside you. This bad air, they believed, was what caused disease. So, ironically, taking a bath to stay clean might actually make you more vulnerable to illness. You weren't being hygienic. You were tempting fate, inviting sickness right into your body through your opened pores. This wasn't some fringe belief either. We have records of King Henry IV of England reportedly avoiding bathing because he was genuinely worried that water would loosen his humors. Now, he wasn't concerned about his sense of humor. He was talking about the 4 bodily humors: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, which was the dominant medical theory of the time. People actually believed that these 4 substances needed to stay in perfect balance for you to be healthy. Too much hot water could supposedly throw off that delicate equilibrium and kill you. To be fair to medieval doctors, if you'd lived through a few plague outbreaks and seen seemingly healthy people die after visiting a bathhouse, you might start making the same kinds of wrong connections too. It's actually pretty understandable how they got there, even if the conclusion was completely incorrect. That said, not every single bath-related law was designed to ruin your skincare routine. Some genuinely had decent public health intentions behind them. When bathhouses became genuine disease vectors, which did happen, local authorities sometimes required owners to completely drain and replace the water daily or face serious fines. Some towns even had rules preventing sick people from entering public bathing facilities, which feels pretty reasonable by any standard. But then you get the weird laws. One town in Bohemia forbade bathing entirely during Lent because the institution considered it too indulgent. And there are documented cases of towns fining people for bathing at night when it was harder for authorities to supervise what else might be happening behind those steamy walls. Medieval paranoia about unsupervised bathing was genuinely intense. Here's one that will make your modern self cringe. In parts of 14th century Germany, it was actually a punishable offense to heat bath water too hot. The reasoning was that steam specifically encouraged what they called lascivious behavior. So you see, medieval lawmakers were literally rating water temperature on the sin scale. Lukewarm water? You're fine. Hot and steamy? You're probably summoning demons. This is the level of detail these people worked with. Surprisingly, some monasteries took a different approach entirely. They kept strict, structured bathing schedules for monks, though certainly not daily schedules. These were carefully documented. One particularly meticulous abbey had a rule that allowed monks exactly 4 baths per year, unless they were sick or had traveled more than 20 leagues. In that case, they could squeeze in a bonus wash as a reward for their hardship. Congratulations! You earned yourself a bath. The scholarly debate on this topic is pretty interesting. Were medieval people actually dirtier than we imagine? Or is that largely a Victorian myth imposed on the medieval period? Historians argue about this constantly. The filthy medieval peasant stereotype probably comes more from Victorian-era bias and propaganda than actual historical fact. Archaeological evidence tells us that many people did wash regularly, especially during warmer months when access to rivers and public baths was easier. Soap made from animal fat and ash was actually commonly produced and traded. But if you were living in extreme poverty, stuck in a thatched hut with no well nearby, yeah, you probably weren't getting very clean. Still, the idea that medieval people just never bathed is seriously overstated. In fact, in warmer regions, parts of Spain and Italy, for instance, frequent bathing was completely normal until religious pressure and disease fears started changing attitudes. By the late Middle Ages, something weird happened. Being too clean actually started making people suspicious. If you showed up looking particularly fresh-faced and smelling of flowers, someone might mutter that you'd been at the bathhouse again, and it definitely wasn't a compliment. Excessive cleanliness became associated with vanity, worldliness, and in some circles, with prostitution. The whole dynamic flipped completely. The bread police and the weight of medieval law. All right. So you managed to avoid bathing on the forbidden days and stayed just dirty enough to avoid suspicion. But now you're hungry, your stomach's rumbling, and you smell fresh bread from the market. Wonderful! Except there's a problem. In medieval towns, bread wasn't just food, it was actually criminally serious business. There were entire legal systems dedicated to bread regulation, and if you messed up a loaf as a baker, you might find yourself face to face with what we could only reasonably call the bread police. These weren't officials in cape made of rye crust or anything theatrical like that, but they were real. They were actual town officials tasked with inspecting, weighing, and even tasting bread at markets. Their job was ostensibly to make sure bakers weren't cheating the public. You see, bread wasn't a luxury item or a side dish in medieval diet. For most people, especially poor people, bread was the diet. Studies suggest that for some medieval peasants, bread made up over 70% of their daily caloric intake. If your daily loaf came up short by even an ounce, that mattered enormously. That missing ounce meant going hungry. Because bakers were human beings motivated by profit, they were constantly tempted to cheat, using slightly less flour, making loaves a little lighter, cutting corners wherever possible. These laws existed specifically to stop them. This led to the famous Assize of Bread and Ale in England, a law that fixed bread prices according to the fluctuating cost of wheat. If wheat was cheap, bread had to be cheaper. If wheat got expensive, prices could rise, but only within strict limits. Cross those limits and you'd face penalties. The consequences for breaking these bread laws were not light. Bakers could be fined extensively. They could face public shaming. In some cases, authorities would force them to give away free bread to the poor as punishment. But the most humiliating punishment was having your bad bread nailed to your shop's front door with a sign that said, "Cheater." Imagine that being your Yelp review in the medieval world. Here's where the baker's dozen actually comes from, and it's honestly kind of sad. Bakers were so terrified of accidentally making underweight bread and getting punished, They started adding an extra loaf to every order of 12 as a safety margin. They weren't being generous. They were terrified. It was a preemptive bribe to the bread police. Here's your order, plus a bonus. Please don't ruin me financially. Some towns even employed designated bread weighers, officials with little iron weights and portable scales who would walk from stall to stall like food critics crossed with accountants. They'd check weight, examine quality, and if your bread came in too light, they could confiscate your entire stock or sentence you to the pillory. If you've never heard of the pillory, imagine a wooden structure with holes for your head and arms. Once stuck in there, the community would throw things at you, spoiled vegetables, dung, whatever they could find while jeering. Getting publicly pelted with rotting turnips because your rye loaf was 2 ounces short would genuinely ruin your week. The regulations weren't just about weight either. They covered ingredients with intense detail. Bread had to be pure. No fillers, no mystery flour. Some bakers would try sneaky substitutions, grinding up beans or adding chalk to stretch their flour supply. If caught, they could be banned from baking for life or forced to eat their own bad bread in front of a jeering crowd. One particularly infamous case in France involved a baker who added powdered bone to stretch his flour. His punishment involved becoming very familiar with the local dungeon. The scholarly debate here centers on whether these strict regulations were actually effective enforcement or just performative theater. Some scholars argue that most towns couldn't consistently enforce bread laws, especially during famine or war. During lean times, regulations were often relaxed, and people knew they were being cheated but accepted it because substandard bread beats starvation. Others point to detailed town records that show regular inspections, consistent fines, and an extensive paper trail of enforcement. So maybe enforcement was quite real after all. There's one particularly grim but very real example. In 1266, during a period of serious food scarcity in London, multiple bakers were publicly executed for selling underweight loaves. Executed. For bread. Let that sink in. This sends an absolutely unmistakable message. Mess with carbohydrates, and you're messing with life itself. The penalty will be severe. Fire curfews and the medieval fear of flames. So you've survived the bread inspections and managed to buy a loaf that's actually the correct weight. You head home as the sun starts setting and everything seems peaceful. But then, clang! The church bell tolls that low, ominous sound. It's the curfew bell, and this isn't just someone's way of telling you to go to bed like you're in some kind of least fun summer camp ever. This is a bell that signals the official time to stop what you're doing, extinguish all your candles and hearth fires, and essentially call it a day. The word curfew actually comes from the old French phrase couvre-feu, which translates literally to cover the fire. That's not poetic. It's incredibly literal. At a specific hour every night, usually right after sunset, a bell would ring across the town, and that was the official signal that you needed to snuff out every open flame, cover your hearth, and get yourself to bed, or at least pretend to. Now, this wasn't just about keeping people out of trouble or enforcing some arbitrary bedtime. This was genuinely about fire prevention, which makes sense when you realize that most medieval towns were essentially constructed from wood, straw, and optimism. A single poorly maintained fireplace, one candle knocked over by a dog, and your entire street could go up in flames faster than you can say, quote, 3. In towns built almost entirely from flammable materials, fire was a genuinely constant threat. So the curfew wasn't primarily about controlling people's behavior. It was about controlling flames before they burned everything down. After the bell rang, nobody was supposed to keep open flames going unless they had an extremely good reason. And yes, someone might literally knock on your door to check. The curfew bell itself became the public timekeeper for the entire community. Most people didn't have access to clocks. That was a luxury item. The bell was how they knew what time it was. It was how they knew when work stopped and night began. In larger towns, the bell would ring from the church tower or a city gatehouse. It had a very distinctive tone, low, slow, ominous, not the peppy ding-dong of a happy church bell. This was more like a sound that meant go inside or else. And here's an interesting twist. The curfew bell also told you when it was safe to start your fire again in the morning. So you had a wake-up bell too. It was like being in the world's least fun summer camp, where someone else controlled your fire privileges and the punishment for breaking the rules could actually be quite serious. In some towns, if there was any visible smoke after the evening bell, you got fined on the spot. In others, repeat offenders could be imprisoned or lose their trading licenses entirely. For a tradesperson, losing your right to do business was essentially a death sentence economically. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the class system at work. In certain towns, wealthy citizens could actually pay for a fire permit. This special license allowed them to keep a small flame going after hours. These permits were rare, expensive, and absolutely a status symbol. If your neighbors saw a faint glow from your windows at midnight, they might mutter something like _quote_4 even bedtime had a class hierarchy built into it. The scholarly debate around curfew enforcement is interesting. How strictly were these laws actually enforced? The answer varies wildly. In some well-organized towns, night watchmen patrolled the streets specifically to enforce curfew. They'd peek into windows, sniff the air for smoke, or literally listen for the telltale crackle of an illicit flame. In smaller or poorer villages, curfew might have been more symbolic, something people nodded at, but didn't follow too closely unless someone got caught or something actually caught fire. But there are records, town ordinances, guild regulations, court documents that mention curfews with all the seriousness of a tax audit. One 13th century London record actually lists a man who was fined for tending his fire past the second bell. Another was fined for loitering in the square without a lantern and without clear purpose. Without lantern or purpose, imagine getting legally roasted for just vibing. That's actually in the historical record. Still, curfew wasn't always purely punitive. Some people actually saw it as a mercy. The world outside your door at night was genuinely dangerous. There were no street lamps. There was no organized police force. If you wandered too far from your home after dark, you had a pretty solid chance of meeting a stray dog, a bored thief, or a literal wandering pig, which could actually attack people. Medieval nights were not the time for leisure activities. They were the time to be inside, behind closed doors. Of course, there were always ways to work around the system. Innkeepers might keep kitchen fires going longer if they had guests from out of town. Smiths sometimes got emergency permits to work at night if a lord's horse needed shoeing. And the clergy, well, they could burn candles all night for prayers. Whether those were actually prayers or just excuses to stay up late, is a question the historical record leaves open. Sunday work bans and the butcher's dilemma. It's Sunday morning, and you wake up to that familiar sound, the church bells calling people to Mass. You've survived another week. Your bread was the right weight. You didn't bathe on forbidden days. Your candles are safely extinguished. You're clean enough to not be suspicious. You're definitely ready to take a break from the constant vigilance. But if you happen to be a butcher, well, congratulations. You're absolutely not allowed to work today. Medieval people took Sundays seriously. Like, really seriously. The day was supposedly reserved for rest, spiritual contemplation, and showing proper reverence. And if there's one profession that was singled out for particular scrutiny, it was butchering. Why? Because the work was messy, public, and involved visible blood. Not exactly the kind of spectacle the church wanted people witnessing on the Lord's Day. The sound of cleavers smacking into bone and the smell of boiling tallow didn't exactly set the mood for prayer, so in many towns, local laws explicitly prohibited butchers from operating on Sundays. No slaughtering animals, no selling meat, nothing. Violations meant fines, suspension of licenses, or in more extreme cases, having your tools publicly confiscated. Imagine walking through town, watching someone parade your blood-stained cleaver like it's a war trophy. That was part of the punishment. But butchers weren't the only targets. In some towns, all forms of manual labor were banned on Sundays. Farming was prohibited. Blacksmithing was forbidden. Brewing was definitely out. The idea was supposedly to enforce rest, but the way they drew the lines was genuinely strange. You could walk to church, obviously. You could eat food as long as it was prepared in advance. You could even gossip in the churchyard, which seems like an exception that undercuts the whole spiritual point. But try cutting a single piece of wood? Fine. Open your shop window? Fine. Sneak in a little bit of trading on the side? Fine and shamed publicly. The laws got so specific they bordered on absurd. In 14th century London, there was an ordinance stating that no animal could be slaughtered in public on a Sunday. But if it was absolutely necessary for the town's health, it had to be done in the shadows under cloth. Picture this: secret butcher operations happening behind sheets in alleyways so that God wouldn't see, or more likely, so the local priest wouldn't find out. It's darkly comedic and deeply medieval. There's an actual recorded case from France where a butcher tried to argue that his cow had died accidentally on Sunday morning and he was just trying to be responsible by not wasting the meat. The local magistrate disagreed. He fined the butcher 2 silver coins and ordered the carcass given to the poor, which is kind of a win-win, maybe, but still a fine for butchering a dead cow. Then there were the loopholes, which you just knew there would be. In some areas, nobles could have meat prepared for them on Sundays by their servants. Of course, rules were different for the rich. This was a consistent pattern throughout medieval life. Sumptu laws applied to peasants, but not nobles. Bathing restrictions were for common folk. Sabbath laws could be conveniently forgotten when your roast duck needed basting. Here's where the scholarly debate gets interesting. Did these laws actually reflect genuine religious devotion, or were they really about social control? Some historians argue that Sabbath laws were a sincere attempt to give working people an actual day of rest and protect religious observance. That's genuinely a nice reading of the situation. Others are more cynical. They argued that these laws were fundamentally about controlling the lower classes and making sure they didn't get too independent or wealthy. Think about it. If only certain trades are forced to close on certain days, that completely changes the economic landscape. Sunday off sounds nice until you realize you're losing a day of profit while the noble across the street just pays someone else to keep the gravy flowing. One interesting historical fact: Sabbath laws actually got stricter in some places over time and became especially harsh as urban centers grew. As towns became more crowded, church leaders became more anxious about worldly distractions. So laws that once just asked for rest started demanding actual silence. Music was banned. Dancing was forbidden. Even public laughter was discouraged. There's a documented case where a man in York was actually cited for what the records describe as indecent mirth outside the cathedral. He literally got in legal trouble for laughing wrong. That's the level of micromanagement we're talking about. The romance police and public displays of affection. All right, you've survived your Sabbath rest, resisted the urge to laugh too loudly near the church, and you've still got all your limbs intact. Now suppose you got someone special in your life. You're not wearing illegal purple. Your shoes are acceptably modest. You finally saved up enough money for a nice walk through the market square with this person, maybe a little hand-holding, a shy smile. And then, oh no, you're about to kiss in public. Congratulations, you've just broken the law. In some medieval towns, public displays of affection were flatly illegal. It didn't matter if you were deeply in love, betrothed, or even already married. Kissing in public wasn't romantic, it was scandalous, and the church wasn't just concerned with what you were doing behind closed doors. They were deeply, invasively invested in how you behaved in public because they believed outward behavior reflected inward purity. If you were locking lips in front of the candle shop, that wasn't romance. That was a moral failure happening where people could see it, and laws existed specifically to curb it. In some places, these rules were written into town ordinances. No kissing in public, no suggestive touching, definitely no lingering stares that went on too long. It sounds ridiculous now, but it was part of a much larger system of behavioral control. You were expected to act with restraint, decency, and constant awareness that God, or at minimum, a very nosy neighbor, was watching. And it wasn't just the church wagging its finger at people. In many cities, secular governments got involved too, passing civil laws to reinforce public decency. In 14th century Florence, there was actually an office called the Office of the Knight that was literally a legal body tasked with policing sexual behavior, particularly among unmarried couples. These officials were out at night watching alleyways. They listened through windows. They were absolutely ready to drag someone into court for inappropriate behavior. Can you imagine being hauled into a courtroom because you kissed your fiancée too enthusiastically? It happened with surprising frequency, but here's a weird economic angle. In certain areas, public kissing was associated with courting rituals, and courting rituals came with specific expectations. Most of those expectations were financial. A kiss wasn't just a kiss. It was a declaration of intent. It suggested engagement. And if you gave that impression and then failed to follow through with marriage, you could be accused of fraud, romantic fraud. There are actual documented cases where women sued men who kissed them in public and then failed to propose. He said he loved me wasn't just heartbreak. It could be a legitimate legal argument, and sometimes it worked. Class complications made everything weirder. The nobility could get away with a little flirtation, maybe a hidden kiss in a corridor, maybe a dramatic hand kiss at a feast. But for commoners, public displays of affection were often punished harshly, especially if it crossed class lines. A noble kissing a servant in public would cause scandal. A servant kissing a noble? That could lead to public punishment, whipping, fines, or exile, because in their minds, romance wasn't just about feelings, it was about order. Kissing outside your station was like wearing silk when you belonged in wool. It was a social offense and a legal one. The scholarly debate here centers on whether these laws were enforced consistently or mostly used as scare tactics. Some historians argue they were largely symbolic, meant to reinforce ideals of purity and morality more than actually catch offenders. Others point to detailed court records showing real people fined, punished, and publicly shamed for public affection. In one German city, a man was actually put in the pillory for embracing his betrothed too boldly in daylight. Can you imagine the awkward wedding toast that would inspire? And then there's the reverse enforcement situation. In some parts of rural England, local tradition actually required newlyweds to kiss in front of the entire village as proof that the marriage was consummated, or at least heading in that direction. So you spend years trying not to kiss in public, and then suddenly you're forced to do it while old women throw rice at you and someone plays an out-of-tune flute. The language police and the Latin barrier. Now let's say you've managed to navigate the romance laws and found a way to show affection without getting arrested. You head home with your beloved and decide to spend the evening doing something intellectual, maybe reading a book or attempting to learn Latin. But wait, in some parts of medieval Europe, speaking Latin without proper authorization was basically asking for serious trouble. Latin was the language of power. It was used in religious services, legal documents, medicine, science, philosophy, basically everything important. If you could speak or write in Latin, that signaled education, access, and a place in the intellectual elite. It was like having a graduate degree that also gave you the keys to every library and courtroom in Europe. And if you didn't belong to that group but tried to act like you did, you were crossing a very serious line. In regions where universities and monastic schools had significant influence, using Latin without being a cleric or qualified academic was seen as a form of social fraud. Think of it like crashing a fancy dinner party in a borrowed tuxedo. You might look the part, but if someone figures you out, you're getting kicked out. There are actual records of people being banned from speaking Latin in public if they weren't of the cloth or properly educated. Sometimes these rules were written down formally. Other times they were just understood. A social minefield for anyone too curious with a tongue too sharp. Why were authorities so protective? Latin wasn't just a language, it was gatekeeping in verbal form. It kept outsiders out of important conversations, legal proceedings, and theological debates. If you couldn't understand Latin, you couldn't participate. And that was very much the point. Most people spoke their local vernacular, English, French, German, Flemish, whatever. Latin was a completely different world. A cleric could read a will aloud at a funeral, and nobody would question a word, even if he was sneaking in a clause that gave the church an extra cow. Nobody would even know. They didn't speak the language. Here's a genuinely strange historical fact. Some monasteries actually invented their own internal dialects of Latin, essentially church slang. So even if an outsider did somehow learn Latin, they'd still be completely confused. It was like pig Latin, but with more judgment and considerably less playfulness. These altered forms were often used in internal documents or whispered during disciplinary meetings just to make sure Brother Thomas didn't leak gossip to the stable boys. Even stranger, there were historical moments where women were explicitly banned from learning Latin in certain schools and monasteries. The reasoning was that women couldn't be trusted with a language that gave them access to philosophical and religious texts, which is a weird way of admitting that Latin was powerful. So powerful, in fact, that it had to be protected like a medieval nuclear code. The scholarly debate here centers on whether these Latin restrictions were formalized in law or more of an enforced cultural rule. Some researchers argue there weren't many explicit written laws banning non-clergy from speaking Latin. It was more of a know-your-place social system policed by social scorn rather than formal state punishment. Others point to a few town charters and ecclesiastical records that suggest actual policies about who could legally translate or recite Latin in public. It gets even more complicated when you bring in the wandering scholars, young men who had picked up some university training but had no money, no formal degree, and way too much time. These guys would drift from town to town, quoting Latin poetry in taverns to impress girls or scamming locals by pretending to be messengers from bishops. They were seen as genuinely dangerous, not because they were violent, but because they had words, knowledge. In a world where the majority couldn't read their own names, that represented real power. Scrawny guys with ink-stained fingers could be as threatening as armored knights, depending on what came out of their mouths. The pointy shoe crisis. You've learned not to speak Latin unless you're authorized to. You've kept your romantic displays appropriately secretive. And now you're just trying to pick out a decent pair of shoes. How hard could that be? Well, as it turns out, extremely hard, because in medieval Europe, there were actual laws regulating the shape of your footwear. If your shoe toes curled too far past your actual toes, you could get fined, mocked, or even banned from certain buildings. Around the 14th century, a fashion trend swept across Europe. These shoes were called poulaines, also known as the Krakowski shoe. They featured long, narrow designs with extended curved toes that sometimes reached up to 2 feet beyond the actual foot. They started with nobility, of course, because who else would turn the simple act of walking into a balancing act just for the sake of fashion? But soon, like all good trends, the style trickled down to the merchant class, and then even lower. Suddenly, peasants were hobbling around in curly-toed monstrosities that served absolutely no functional purpose except making them look slightly more prince-like. This is when the outrage really started. Church leaders, city councils, and even kings saw these shoes as a threat to morality and social order. The logic, if you can call it logic, went something like this. If peasants are wearing fancy shoes, what's next? Gold belts, flavored bread, dogs in hats. The horror. So laws were passed. Some two laws, the same types that restricted fabrics and colors, were now aimed directly at your toes. In 1463, King Edward IV of England passed a decree that limited the length of shoe points to 2 inches for commoners. Only nobles of high rank were allowed to wear poulaines with longer tips, and even then they had to be careful not to go full clown mode. Enforcement varied depending on where you were, but the message was crystal clear. Shoes were status symbols, and status needed to be enforced at ground level, literally. Here's the quirky twist. The longer the shoe, the more impractical it became. Some nobles apparently tied the tips of their poulaines to their garters, just to keep them from dragging through mud or tripping them in doorways. Imagine trying to run from a fire or dodge a horse cart with your feet laced up like spaghetti. It was fashion warfare, and comfort was definitely the first casualty. Let's not pretend this was all about class maintenance either. There was also a heavy dose of moral panic. Clergy members frequently preached that long pointed shoes were a sign of vanity, arrogance, and, of course, sexual deviance. Yes, following the established pattern of medieval thinking, there were actual sermons warning that overly pointy shoes were the devil's tools. They led men and women to lustful thoughts and ungodly behavior, because apparently nothing tempts the human soul quite like a sharply pointed foot. Scholars still debate how seriously these shoe laws were actually taken. Some argue they were largely ignored outside major cities, and that in smaller towns, people wore whatever they could afford, even if it meant looking like they'd borrowed their footwear from a jester. Others point to actual records of fines and confiscations, suggesting that fashion policing was very real and very personal. Imagine being hauled before the town magistrate while someone holds up your boots like damning evidence in a court case. Is this your pain, sir? Please explain these 8-inch toes. Of course, not everyone hated the poulaines. Some chroniclers saw them as artistic or even avant-garde. Shoe design during the period was shockingly creative. We have archaeological finds of shoes dyed bright colors, embroidered with gold, even shaped like animal heads. But always fashion was political. The way you dressed wasn't just personal self-expression. It was a public declaration of who you were, your class, and whether you understood the rules of the game. Here's the fun irony. When the pointy shoe laws came into effect, the style quickly fell out of fashion. Not because of the laws themselves, but because styles just shifted, as they always do. Rounded toe shoes came back. Platform soles became popular. Fur linings were fashionable for a while. The poulaines ended up looking ridiculous and old-fashioned, and even the nobles quietly retired their lace-up danger weapons. Still, the laws lingered. For decades after the poulaine had gone completely out of fashion, some cities still banned shoes with exaggerated points just in case they came back. That's how traumatized the population had become by pointy shoes. The memory haunted them for generations. The afterlife bureaucracy, medieval bone management. Your skeleton doesn't belong to you. Not really. Once you die, it becomes property of the church in many medieval regions. Let that sink in. Your remains, your bones, your physical legacy, they're subject to an entirely different legal system. In parts of Catholic Europe, particularly in Central and Eastern regions, the church didn't just want your immortal soul. They wanted your body too. Once you were deceased, you didn't automatically get to rest peacefully or have your family bury you according to their wishes. The church often claimed legal and spiritual control over human remains, and what happened next could get deeply weird. If you were someone of minor importance, maybe a scribe, a successful merchant, or a knight who didn't do anything particularly legendary, you'd probably get a normal Christian burial in consecrated ground. Your bones would rest under soil. Until the church needed that grave space back, of course. Grave plots in crowded towns weren't infinite, and bones were constantly exhumed to make room for newer corpses. What happened to those remains? They didn't just disappear. In many churches, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe, bones were collected and stored in ossuaries, designated chambers, crypts, or entire underground cathedrals filled wall to wall with skulls, femurs, and jawbones. You've probably seen pictures of the famous Sedlec ossuary in the Czech Republic, where monks arranged bones into chandeliers and wall art. That was someone's grandmother, dangling above the altar. Why would the church do this? Two main reasons. First was efficiency. Grave space was limited, especially during plagues or wars when mortality skyrocketed. Second was symbolism. These bone-filled crypts were considered reminders of mortality, a kind of theological flex. Look upon these bones and remember, you too will die. So maybe tithe a little more generously this Sunday. Here's the genuinely quirky part. Not all skeletons were treated equally. If you were holy, powerful, or just lucky, your bones might be turned into a relic. That meant being chopped into smaller pieces and distributed among churches like collectible holy action figures. Your femur might end up in a cathedral in Paris, your skull in a monastery in Bavaria, your left thumb probably displayed in a glass box somewhere that charged pilgrims a few coins just to look at it. Saintly remains became big business. And yes, there were actually violent arguments over who got to keep which bones. In one particularly absurd case, two churches both claimed to own the same saint's head. One refused to give it up, so the other claimed they had the real one. For years, both skulls were displayed simultaneously, and nobody had the guts to say, "Hey, how many heads does this guy have?" Answer, definitely more than he's supposed to have. Now here's where things get ethically murky. In many regions, the church had legal authority to refuse burial to anyone it deemed impure. Suicide victims couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. Criminals were denied entry. Heretics definitely weren't welcome. Excommunicated individuals? Absolutely not. Their bodies might be dumped in unmarked graves, burned, or simply left to decay. In some towns, a person who had fallen out of favor with the church could even have their remains dug up years later and reburied in a less honorable spot. Medieval posthumous cancellation was very real. You could face condemnation after death. The scholarly debate here is whether the church literally owned your skeleton or if that was more of a spiritual claim. Some historians argue that the control was primarily symbolic, meant to emphasize the church's role as gatekeeper to the afterlife. Others argue it was more than symbolic, that ecclesiastical courts and property laws explicitly gave churches the right to move, store, and display human remains however they saw fit. The truth is probably both. Spiritually, your soul was the important thing, but legally, your body was subject to the whims of whoever had the biggest, oldest, and most intimidating cathedral nearby. Here's a lesser-known but genuinely delightful fact. Some nobles and monarchs requested to have specific body parts buried in different places. Like, my heart goes to Canterbury, but bury the rest of me at Westminster Abbey. Why? Partly political. Multiple shrines meant more pilgrims, which meant more prestige. Partly sentimental. One noble reportedly wanted his heart buried next to his favorite hunting dog. We all grieve in different ways, apparently. The lightning rod problem. Bell ringing. During storms. Back when you were still alive and kicking, there was another job that nobody really wanted. ringing the church bell during thunderstorms. This sounds wild, but people genuinely believed for centuries that ringing consecrated bells during storms would scare away evil spirits, especially the kind of spirits that rode in on thunder and lightning. So many churches assigned someone to go up into the bell tower and ring the bells whenever the sky started looking ominous. The logic was that the sound of sanctified bells would drive off demons, bad weather, and anything else that might ruin crops or start fires. It's kind of touching in a desperate way, the idea that sound could protect you from divine wrath. But here's the twist. Metal bell towers combined with elevated structures in stormy weather equal lightning magnets, and the results were gruesome and entirely predictable. Bell ringers, often young apprentices or unlucky priests, died doing this job, not once or twice. We're talking dozens, even hundreds of documented cases where someone got struck by lightning while ringing the bells. In France alone, it's estimated that more than 100 bell ringers were killed by lightning between the 12th and 18th centuries. Not only did the bell ringers die, but sometimes entire towers caught fire. Roofs caved in. Sometimes the bells themselves cracked from sheer heat and force. Eventually, even the most stubborn bishops started to put two and two together. Maybe, they reasoned, God didn't actually want people ringing giant metal instruments at the exact moment he was throwing electrical bolts around. This led to a slow but steady shift in church policy. By the 18th century, ringing bells during storms had been banned outright in many regions. But in the high medieval period, it was still hotly debated. You had traditionalists insisting the bells had to be rung no matter what. The storm was happening because the bells weren't being rung early enough. Others, slightly more scientifically minded, or just tired of burying charred apprentices, argued for restraint. Some towns developed special non-metallic bell ropes or lightning rituals to protect the ringer. A few even blessed the bell ropes with holy water or hung small relics around the belfry to guard the space. This is basically like putting garlic around your Wi-Fi router and hoping it keeps the malware away. The intent was pure. The science wasn't even in the same ballpark. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether people genuinely believed bells could fight storms, or if it was more symbolic. When a storm hit, hearing those bells meant you weren't alone. It was sonic reassurance that the community was doing something. Others point to theological texts that genuinely believed bells had spiritual power. After all, many bells were cast with Latin inscriptions invoking divine protection and were formally baptized before use. Yes, bells were given names, baptized with holy water, and treated as semi-living religious objects. You've got to appreciate that level of commitment to a theory, even if the theory is completely wrong. Eventually, pressure and new thinking about electricity and lightning led to change. Local councils started quietly changing their rules. Some towns banned bell ringing during active lightning. Others started building lightning rods, a practice that took a while to catch on but eventually saved lives. Of course, the first people to propose it were accused of interfering with divine will. Obviously, protecting your tower from lightning meant you didn't trust God to aim properly. Still, it was progress. By the late medieval period, some parishes had finally acknowledged that maybe ringing bells wasn't going to stop a storm, but it might stop several more funerals. The King's Forest and the poaching crisis. All right, by now you're exhausted. You've survived the bread inspectors, the bath bans, the kissing curfews, the skeleton bureaucracy, and definitely the lightning bell tower incident. At this point, you're thinking maybe you should just head into the woods and live off mushrooms. Sounds like a decent plan, except there's a problem. You're probably not allowed to be there. In medieval Europe, the woods didn't belong to everyone. They were controlled, guarded, and absolutely filled with rules and creatures. You weren't even allowed to hunt unless you had the right bloodline, the right title, or a very, very forgiving lord. Welcome to the world of medieval forest laws, where trees had more legal protection than most people, and hunting the wrong rabbit could literally get you executed. Let's start with the big one, the royal forest. That doesn't just mean a pretty stretch of trees the king liked to picnic in. A royal forest was a specific legal designation, a zone where forest law applied. It didn't just cover the trees. It included the animals, the rivers, the airspace, the mushrooms, the grass, the paths, and sometimes even people who happened to live there. The forest was seen as a kind of royal inheritance, especially in England after the Norman conquest. The Normans took forest law with enormous seriousness. Here's how it worked. If land was declared a royal forest, that didn't mean it was full of pine trees. It just meant the king had exclusive hunting rights, especially for big-ticket animals like deer and wild boar. If you, a humble peasant, got caught chasing a rabbit, picking a flower, or gathering firewood in one of these areas, you could be charged with poaching. The penalties included heavy fines or something much worse. And by worse, I mean blinding or death, depending on how generous the sheriff was feeling. There are actual recorded cases where people were mutilated or hanged for hunting game in protected woods, not because they were rebels, not because they were violent, just because they were hungry. Think about that. Your kids are starving. You trap a deer, and suddenly you're being dragged to court for it. Forest law wasn't just about conservation. It was about power, pure power. Here's the genuinely quirky bit. These forest animals had legal personhood in some regions. Deer, for example, were considered beasts of the chase. Killing one unlawfully was not unlike killing a nobleman's prized war horse. They were sacred in a strange bureaucratic way. And since only nobles had the legal right to hunt them, they became walking status symbols. If you had a hunting license, it wasn't just permission for sport. It was proof you were elite. And don't even think about trying to look the part, wearing hunting gear, specific boots, cloaks, or hoods in certain colors was itself considered suspicious. It could be used as evidence that you were a poacher, even if you hadn't caught anything. Fashion as evidence. It never stops. But here's where it gets genuinely dark. Forest law wasn't enforced by friendly park rangers. It was carried out by officials like verderers and foresters who patrolled the woods, collected fines, and organized public trials, sometimes held right in the middle of the forest. There were entire court systems dedicated to this. The Court of Attachments, the Swain Mote, and the Forest Heir. These weren't small-time operations. You could be arrested, tried, and sentenced in a court that existed only to protect the king's trees and deer. The scholarly debate here fascinates historians. Was this actually about environmental preservation, or was it just elite control? Some modern historians argue that forest law was an early, if brutal, form of ecological conservation. It created protected zones where animals could thrive, and it kept large stretches of land from being completely deforested by farming. Others are less generous. They argued that the laws overwhelmingly benefited the rich, punished the poor, and had nothing to do with sustainability. They had everything to do with who was allowed to kill what and where. It's worth noting that these forests weren't just empty wilderness. People lived inside them. Entire communities existed within royal forest boundaries, and they had to navigate a legal minefield every single day. Collecting firewood was illegal unless it had already fallen. Cutting down a tree was definitely illegal. Fishing in a stream was only okay if it wasn't stocked with noble fish, whatever that meant. Even gathering acorns for your pigs, called pannage, required explicit permission. Let's get genuinely weird for a second. There are records of animals being declared off-limits not because they were rare, but because they were considered too noble to die, like the white hart, a type of rare deer. Killing one wasn't just illegal, it was spiritually dangerous. In one tale, a poacher who slew a white hart was said to be cursed and followed by bad luck for the rest of his life. Ghost deer. That's the level of belief we're operating at. Eventually, pressure from commoners forced some changes. Charters were issued like the Charter of the Forest in 1217, which rolled back some of the harshest forest laws. It gave peasants limited rights to gather wood, graze animals, and access water. But the royal grip never fully loosened. The forest remained dangerous places, not because of wolves, but because of bureaucracy. Dancing after dark, and the sin of joy, the curfew bell has rung. Your candles are safely extinguished. You've resisted the urge to kiss anyone in public or bathe on forbidden days. Now all you want is a little fun. Maybe someone brought out a fiddle, and a beat is starting up. Feet are stomping. Skirts are twirling. Music is playing. But then the moment comes, dancing after dark. In medieval Europe, dancing was sometimes actively banned at night, and not because people couldn't keep rhythm. The reasons were far more medieval: fear of demons, disease, and moral chaos. Let's set the scene properly. People genuinely loved dancing across medieval Europe, from dusty village squares to lavish courtly halls. It was part of weddings, festivals, feast days, and harvest celebrations. It was how people flirted, blew off steam, bonded with neighbors, or showed off that they had slightly less arthritis than the guy next to them. Some dances were organized like the carol, a circle dance with singing. Others were less structured, involving spinning, clapping, and the occasional leap that made older villagers mutter under their breath about show-offs. But here's the twist. The church wasn't thrilled about dancing. Not always, not everywhere, but in many regions, particularly when it came to dancing at night. Once the sun went down, the air cooled, and shadows grew long, dancing started looking very suspicious. In the medieval imagination, night was literally the devil's domain. It was when temptation stirred, when virtue faltered, and when things that should have been quiet got loud. Local laws began popping up forbidding dancing after sundown, especially in or near churches. The reasoning was always this murky mix of morality, superstition, and public order. Dancing, they claimed, led to unchaste behavior. It stirred passions. People got handsy. There was laughing. There was, God forbid, unsupervised mingling between unmarried youths. And where there was merriment without oversight, sin surely followed. Here's a weird little fringe fact. In parts of Germany and France, authorities believed excessive dancing could spread disease, both physical and spiritual. There were actual outbreaks of what's now referred to as dancing mania. These were events where entire groups of people would suddenly begin dancing uncontrollably, sometimes for days, until they collapsed from exhaustion or injury. The most famous instance was in Strasbourg in 1518, when dozens of people danced in the streets in a frenzy that may have been caused by ergot poisoning, mass psychosis, or just sheer medieval stress. Whatever the cause, the reaction from local officials wasn't to investigate calmly. No, they banned dancing, built shrines, and tried to exorcise the afflicted. It was chaos. Not every law against dancing was about demonic possession. Some were just about crowd control. Dancing meant gatherings. Gatherings meant gossip, noise, and the risk of disorder. In tight medieval towns with flammable houses and narrow alleys, a crowd of tipsy peasants doing a carol in the dark could very quickly turn into a riot or accidentally start a fire. So curfews were placed not just on candles and soup pots, but on dancing feet. The scholarly debate here centers on whether these laws were actually enforced consistently or whether they were just one of those things local priests preached about while everyone ignored them unless a scandal happened. Some evidence suggests people mostly danced anyway, often in secret. There are written sermons from clergy complaining that the young dance in the moonlight like beasts, which basically means they won't stop, and the priests are really mad about it. And of course, there were class issues. Nobles could dance whenever and wherever they liked. Their dances were more formal, slower, done indoors with proper musicians, chaperones, and wine that didn't come in clay jugs. When peasants danced in the streets, it looked wild, spontaneous, sweaty, which was fun for them but terrifying for anyone in power. So as always, the rules weren't evenly applied. A baron's daughter dancing by candlelight in a marble hall? Artistic. A blacksmith's daughter dancing barefoot in the mud after curfew? Scandalous. There's no question which one faced legal consequences. The tavern mug problem and hygiene issues. After the music fades and the forbidden footwork comes to a halt, you find yourself in a tavern trying to relax. Your body's tired. Your soul's tired from dodging forest laws and medieval micromanagement. All you want is a cold mug of ale to take the edge off. You walk up to the bar, smile at the innkeeper, and order your drink. He grunts and fills a wooden mug, then slides it toward you. But instead of just handing it off, he glances down at your hand, then at your belt. "Where's your mug?" he asks. That's when you remember. You were supposed to bring your own drinking vessel because, yes, in many parts of medieval Europe, you were legally and socially expected to carry your own mug. In modern life, you go to a bar, and the place provides the cups. Easy, sanitary, no questions asked. Medieval taverns worked completely differently, especially in rural towns and along well-traveled roads. It was totally normal and sometimes even required for patrons to bring their own drinking vessel. Think of it as the original BYOB culture, except it stood for Bring Your Own Bowl. Why? A few practical reasons. First, taverns didn't always have enough clean mugs for everyone, especially during feast days, market days, or when traveling knights decided to celebrate not dying in battle. Second, mugs were valuable, even wooden ones. They were hand-carved, often personalized, and genuinely hard to replace. If a tavern provided mugs for everyone, they'd constantly lose them to theft, breakage, or customers wandering off mid-hangover with someone else's drinking vessel. So people carried their own. Many had mugs strapped to their belts or hung from cords over their shoulders. Some had metal tankards, others used horn, wood, or ceramic. In towns with more formal ale houses, you might be provided with a mug if you were a regular, but you could never assume it. In country inns, especially the kind with dirt floors and goats milling around, it was simple. No mug, no mead. Here's where it gets legally weird. In some areas, local laws actually regulated drinking vessels. If you brought a mug that held more than the standard measure, you could be accused of cheating the tavern out of profits. Likewise, if the innkeeper served ale in an undersized mug, he could be fined under laws regulating the size of ale. Yes, they literally sent officials called ale tasters to inspect taverns and make sure customers weren't being shortchanged. So imagine this scenario. You bring your own mug to the tavern, hang it proudly on the bar, and an ale taster walks in. He pulls out a standard measure and carefully fills your mug. If it holds too little, no problem. But if it holds more than it should, the innkeeper gets suspicious. Are you trying to trick me into overpouring? Suddenly, you're part of an impromptu medieval investigation over a few extra drops of barley beer. Here's a delightfully quirky fact. In some places, taverns used shared mugs that were actually attached to the bar by chains. Yes, chains. You could drink, but not walk off with the mug. These were usually crude, metal-bound wooden tankards built to survive rough handling and the occasional drunken sword fight. And you can bet that health codes were not a thing. If the last guy at the bar had a cold, well, you just inherited it. Hope your immune system had its porridge today. Speaking of germs, that's the scholarly debate. Did medieval people actually understand disease transmission well enough to care about shared drinking vessels? Some historians argue they didn't, and that the preference for personal mugs was more about tradition and property than hygiene. Others point out that folk wisdom did link sickness with proximity and sharing, and that some towns even had laws discouraging communal use of bowls or cups during outbreaks of plague or pestilence. Either way, carrying your own mug was a handy solution and a kind of social currency. People judged you by your drinkware. Wealthier patrons had finely carved wooden tankards or pewter mugs engraved with family symbols. Travelers often had collapsible horn cups tucked into leather satchels. One legend even tells of a man who drank from a silver chalice shaped like a fish, which honestly feels excessive but deeply on brand for medieval overachievers. Over time, of course, the practice faded. As taverns became more established and drinking customs more standardized, especially in cities, innkeepers took on the burden of providing cups, though they were often quick to demand payment if anything was broken or stolen. Marriage by proxy, matrimony at a distance. So you're drinking from someone else's chain-attached mug and trying not to think about whose cold you've inherited. You finally had a moment of peace when suddenly someone catches your eye across the tavern. It's that special person. But there's a problem. They're leaving tomorrow, heading hundreds of miles away, maybe to war, maybe to inherit a sheep farm. You panic. Marry me, you say. They say yes. But you can't leave, so what do? You send someone else. That's right. In the Middle Ages, you could actually get married by proxy without even being there yourself. Marriage by proxy wasn't just legal in many medieval societies. It was surprisingly common, especially among nobles and royals. The basic concept: if you couldn't attend your own wedding, someone else, usually a trusted male relative or advisor, could stand in for you during the ceremony. They go through all the motions. Say your vows. offer the symbolic token, a ring, or sometimes a belt or glove, even kiss the bride, all on your behalf. In many cases, these proxy marriages weren't weird at all. They were strategic. Political alliances between kingdoms often depended on a timely marriage. If a princess in France needed to marry a prince in Spain, they weren't going to risk months of dangerous travel just for a ceremony. Instead, she'd marry his representative, sometimes in front of a cathedral full of witnesses. Then, weeks or months later, the actual couple would meet and complete the union. Yes, in every sense of the word. One of the most famous examples is Catherine of Aragon's proxy marriage to Prince Arthur of England in 1499. Catherine was in Spain. Arthur was in England, so a Spanish noble stood in for the prince. They went through the entire wedding ceremony like it was perfectly normal, because for them it was. Here's where it gets delightfully quirky. Sometimes the proxy stood in not just for the vows, but for the entire honeymoon. Not in the literal physical sense, thankfully, but symbolically. In some ceremonies, a sword or a piece of armor was laid in bed between the bride and the proxy to represent the absent groom. It was a bizarre blend of ritual, symbolism, and awkwardness that only medieval minds could dream up. Marriage by proxy wasn't just for nobility. There are recorded cases of merchant families using the same system. If a groom was away on business for years but wanted to lock in a marriage and its associated dower, he could send someone to stand in for him. Once the ceremony was done, the contract was valid, rights confirmed, dower secured. It was essentially long-distance commitment, medieval style. Here's where the legal headache comes in. If someone got married by proxy and later refused to consummate the marriage, or if either party claimed they never truly consented, things got dicey fast. Church courts had to figure out what counted as a valid marriage. Was it the vows? The witnesses? The fact that someone else kissed your spouse for you while you were busy fighting in Flanders? There's a particularly strange case involving a woman who married a man by proxy, then learned he died before the ceremony even took place. Technically, she'd become a widow without ever meeting her husband. The local court, in true medieval logic, ruled that the marriage still stood posthumously. She was now a grieving widow and entitled to the dower. Poor timing, worse luck. The scholarly debate here is whether proxy marriage was rare, but important for royal diplomacy, or more common than we think, and just undocumented. Records suggest that in many port towns and trade hubs, people used proxies to manage not just marriages, but engagements, inheritance rights, and betrothals, especially when long-distance travel was slow, dangerous, and likely to end in dysentery. Proxy arrangements made practical sense. Eventually, proxy marriages began to fade, especially with improved travel and communication. The church also started emphasizing the importance of mutual consent, present and clear, between both actual parties. But the legal echoes lingered for centuries. In fact, some countries still recognize proxy marriage in certain circumstances, like for military personnel or people imprisoned, mandatory combat training, and your holiday homework. After surviving a proxy wedding, and probably wondering how that works logistically, you're nursing bruised feelings and wondering what else could possibly be regulated. Let's say you've dodged all the major legal problems and maybe even earned yourself some respect in your community. But if you're a knight or training to become one, surprise, you don't get weekends. Your mandatory holiday assignment is combat practice. That's right. In some parts of medieval Europe, especially in the later Middle Ages, knights were legally required to train on holidays. No jousting in July, no sword drills in spring. Forget about it. If it was a feast day or Sunday afternoon, and you were of noble blood or held land in exchange for military service, you were expected to be out in a field sweating through your armor, while some lord's son took a wooden lance to your ribs. Because nothing says sacred day of rest like organized violence in full-plate mail, here's how this worked. During times of peace, lords and kings still needed to make sure their fighting men didn't get soft. So they passed laws requiring regular martial exercises. These weren't private hobbies. They were feudal obligations. Just like you owed your lord taxes or service in war, you also owed him a sword arm that didn't wobble from too much ale and not enough sparring. Some regions scheduled formalized training days, often falling on religious holidays or feast days, when townspeople would gather to watch knights and squires go through drills, sparring, and mounted combat. It might sound strange, forcing someone to work on a holiday, but the logic made sense in medieval thinking. Feast days meant crowds, and crowds meant a chance to show off military readiness. If you were a noble, being seen in public in armor, displaying your skill with a sword, was part of maintaining your status. If you tripped over your own sword belt in front of your vassals, you'd never live it down. These weren't casual sparring matches either. In places like France, England, and the Germanic states, there were entire events built around tournaments and mock battles, often sanctioned by law. Sometimes, participation was required to prove your ongoing value as a vassal. If you skipped out too often, you could be summoned to court and questioned about your loyalty. Worse, you could lose favor with your liege lord. The quirky fringe fact: there were laws governing how rough practice could get. During certain feast day tournaments, knights were only allowed to use blunted weapons. In some towns, they had to sign agreements not to intentionally maim each other. You know you're living in a particular kind of world when "please don't decapitate your sparring partner" has to be written into law. Yet accidents still happened. Broken bones, concussions, even deaths. A 15th century account from Burgundy describes a squire who accidentally killed a nobleman during a training bout. His punishment was an entire year's income and having to donate a stained glass window to the local cathedral. That's expensive remorse. Of course, some lords were lenient, treating these sessions more like pageantry than preparation, but others, especially in frontier regions or unstable territories, were strict. If you were part of a noble household, you were expected to train regularly. It wasn't optional. It was part of your legal identity, just like your coat of arms or your manor house. Saltless bread and culinary crime. You've survived your mandatory combat training with your limbs mostly intact. Now, you're just trying to make some bread. But there's one more rule. Medieval people were obsessed with salt. And salt wasn't just a flavoring, it was a legal requirement. If you were planning to sell bread, you needed to make sure it was made with proper quantities of salt. This sounds like a weird legal requirement until you remember that salt was huge in the medieval world. Salt was so important that laws controlled how it was used, bought, and sold, especially in everyday staples like bread. In parts of Germany and France, town guilds had strict regulations about bread making. Salt had to be included in specified quantities, and it had to be of a certain quality. If you tried to cut corners, used muddy salt from an unapproved source, or skipped it entirely, you risked being hauled before the guild tribunal. They'd weigh your loaves, sniff them, sometimes even taste them. It wasn't just about making a product. It was about upholding civic responsibility through carbohydrates. Here's the quirky fringe fact. In a few regions, if a baker was found guilty of omitting salt, their punishment was being publicly paraded with a loaf of their own saltless bread hung around their neck. Imagine the shame of walking through your village while kids point and whisper about the salt guy. Worse, in Italian cities like Florence, saltless bread was associated with poverty, stinginess, or outright incompetence. Selling such a loaf wasn't just a culinary error. It was a social statement. Ironically, Tuscany is famous today for its traditional unsalted bread, pane toscano, which pairs beautifully with salty meats and cheeses. But that trend started for a completely different reason: tax avoidance. Back in the 12th century, when various political powers were feuding, the Papal States started heavily taxing salt. So the Tuscans basically said, "Fine, we just won't use it." That led to an entire regional cuisine built around the absence of salt. Salt rebellion, basically. Resistance turned into flavor. But in most of medieval Europe, that trick wouldn't fly. Salt was essential, and salt laws were everywhere. In some towns, bakers were required to buy their salt directly from a state-licensed supplier, ensuring both quality and a juicy tax revenue stream for authorities. These laws were enforced so well that bakers would sometimes be randomly inspected, with officials cracking open loaves and checking for proper salt content. If the bread tasted bland, the baker paid. The scholarly debate centers on whether these salt laws were about food quality or control. Some argue they were genuinely about protecting consumers from bad bread. Saltless loaves went stale faster and could breed mold. Others point to the central role of salt taxes in medieval economies. Salt was heavily regulated not just because of health, but because it was lucrative. Governments didn't want people going rogue, harvesting their own salt or skipping it in bread, where they could easily monitor it. The gossip laws and scolding bridles. By now, you're exhausted from legal compliance. Your bread is properly salted. Your candles are extinguished. You're clean enough to not be suspicious, dressed appropriately for your station. All you want to do is sit in a tavern and vent about your neighbor who's been acting weird. But careful, because spreading rumors in medieval towns could get you fined, branded, or even run out of town. Everyone gossips. It's practically a universal human pastime, older than fire and more addictive than salted bread. But in the Middle Ages, gossip wasn't just idle chatter. It was dangerous. It could ruin reputations, disrupt marriages, and, most terrifying to authorities, lead to actual unrest. Town councils, village courts, and church authorities all understood one critical thing. Words could topple more than friendships. They could topple entire communities. So naturally, they passed laws to stop it. In many medieval towns across England, France, and the Low Countries, there were specific ordinances against scandal-mongering, idle chatter, and defaming words. These weren't vague warnings either. Some laws went into stunning detail, listing particular phrases that could land you in court. Accusing someone of theft, promiscuity, heresy, or even laziness could earn you a public penalty if you couldn't prove it. If you said someone watered down their wine or cheated at market scales and they took offense, you'd better have a witness. Otherwise, prepare to stand in front of the village with a sign around your neck reading, "Liar." This wasn't about protecting feelings, it was about maintaining order. In a world where family honor was everything and revenge was often just one insult away, keeping a lid on community tension was critical. Gossip was treated like a spark in a dry haystack, seemingly small, potentially catastrophic. A whisper could lead to a duel. A rumor could lead to a riot. The legal term often used was defamation, and medieval defamation cases were common features of local courts. Some areas had entire scolding courts dedicated to sorting through these interpersonal flame wars. In these courts, women were disproportionately represented, not because they were inherently more gossipy, but because the law presumed they were. This brings us to one of the weirdest punishments ever devised, the scold's bridle, also called the brank. This device was a metal cage fitted over the head, often with a plate that pressed into the tongue to prevent speech. Offenders were marched through town squares while wearing it, sometimes with bells attached to draw maximum attention and shame. And yes, it was used almost exclusively on women. The reasoning? Society had decided that a scolding woman, a term basically meaning too opinionated, was a threat to moral stability. But men weren't safe either. In some towns, male gossips were punished with stocks, fines, or public confessionals. One German town's records list a case where a merchant accused another of sleeping with the butcher's wife. He couldn't prove it. Instead of a duel, he was ordered to pay for a barrel of wine for the entire town as a symbolic gesture of apology. Costly mistake. There were even eavesdropping laws. Yes, listening to gossip could get you in trouble. If you were caught loitering near windows under eaves, hence the term eavesdropping, or near fences to overhear private conversations, you could be fined. Medieval communities treated privacy with suspicious intensity. What was said behind closed doors should stay there, or else. Were these gossip laws really about truth, or were they tools for social control? Some argue they protected reputations and kept peace in tight-knit communities. When you live in a town of 300 people, a single rumor follows you for life. Others see it differently, arguing these laws silenced dissent, especially among the lower classes and women. A town council could punish rumors that sounded like political criticism. A priest could suppress accusations of corruption by calling them slander. It wasn't always about harmony. It was often about power, the hue and cry, community, vigilante justice. Finally, you've managed not to spread any damaging gossip. You've kept your opinions to yourself, which is exhausting. But now you hear it. Someone's about to raise the hue and cry. A man runs past yelling something about the baker's barn going up in flames. Another shouts about a stolen goat. Suddenly, people are pouring into the square. In modern terms, hue and cry sounds like something out of a dramatic indie band or a really enthusiastic group chat. But in the Middle Ages, it was a literal legal obligation. If you saw a crime, say a theft, an assault, or someone setting fire to your neighbor's haystack, you were legally required to make as much noise as possible. You were supposed to shout, ring bells, bang on doors. You could blow a horn if you had one. The goal was to alert the entire community that a criminal was on the loose. But it didn't stop at shouting. That was just the beginning. Once the hue and cry was raised, Everyone who heard it was required by law to join the chase. Not just guards, not just the town reeve. Everyone from the blacksmith to the schoolboy to the grandmother with bad knees. If you were able-bodied or even moderately hobbling, you were expected to drop what you were doing and help catch the suspect. This was law, not optional. If you failed to join the chase, you could be fined, jailed, or held partially responsible for whatever the criminal did next. That's right. Medieval justice meant you had personal liability for not helping. The system roots go back to the Anglo-Saxon era and were formally codified under laws like the Assize of Arms and various town statutes across England and France. The core idea was that justice was a group responsibility. In a world without standing police forces, CCTV, or criminal databases, catching a thief meant literally chasing them down in a mob. And it wasn't just dramatic flair. The hue and cry was surprisingly effective, especially in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's face, tunic, and suspicious goat. You could run, but you probably weren't going far. Roads were rough, woods were full of prying eyes. Every village had its own version of a wanted wall, usually just a place where locals carved names or left charcoal sketches on wooden posts. Here's the quirky twist. The hue and cry could be abused. Some people raised false alarms either to harass enemies, create distractions for real crimes, or just stir up chaos. This led to laws against malicious raising of hue and cry, which carried serious penalties. In one recorded case, a woman in York accused her neighbor of stealing a chicken, raised the alarm, and caused a 2-day manhunt. The chicken turned up in her own garden. She was fined and forced to stand in the square holding the very chicken. Justice served extra crispy. Another odd detail: you didn't actually have to witness a crime in progress. If you arrived at the scene and saw signs of crime, an opened lock, a broken window, a bloody boot print, you were still expected to raise the hue and cry. Once the bell was sounded or the call made, the local constable took over. He'd organize search parties, question witnesses, and often lead the pursuit himself. Think of him as the manager of the neighborhood mob. And so, here you are. Somehow, against all odds, you've survived the world of medieval weirdness. You navigated bread laws with a weary eye on your scales. You buttoned your clothes according to your social rank. You kissed your beloved in legal time slots. You fought mock battles on your holy days. You learned not to bathe too publicly, not to sing too loudly, not to wear the wrong fur, and definitely not to wave your left hand around in polite company. Honestly, if medieval life were an escape room, you'd be a champion by now. But it's nighttime again. The hearth is safely covered, your candles extinguished because, yes, the curfew bell rang a while ago. You've resisted the urge to gossip. You haven't committed any bread crimes. Nobody's raised a hue and cry over your suspiciously well-stitched tunic. You lie back on your straw mattress, still wearing your Sumptu-approved undergarments, and stare up at the rafters. You think about how bizarrely intricate and alarmingly specific your life is under this mountain of rules. And yet, here's the strange thing. All those weird medieval rules weren't as ridiculous as they first seemed. Sure, they sound like something out of a bureaucratic fever dream. But when you really look beneath the surface of fines and fashion edicts and bread inspections, they reveal a society desperately trying to hold itself together. It was a world without modern science, without police, without public health infrastructure, doing its best to maintain order, identity, and survival. The rules might seem absurd now, but back then they were lifelines. Weird, tangled lifelines, but lifelines all the same. A way of saying, we don't have it all figured out. But if everyone sticks to their lane, maybe, just maybe, we'll make it through the next winter. And that's kind of beautiful in a please don't wear purple if you're not royal sort of way. So as you drift off tonight, imagine the flickering torchlight outside your window. Picture the quiet footsteps of a watchman on patrol. Hear the soft echo of a distant church bell marking the passage of time. Maybe imagine a group of monks arguing about soap, or a baker nervously weighing a loaf while a child counts the coins, or someone whispering something they definitely shouldn't in a crowded tavern. The Middle Ages were strange, messy, rigid, and wonderfully human. They were a time when bread had the power to start riots, when fashion could get you arrested, when even your left hand could mark you as suspicious. Every aspect of daily life was governed by intricate rules designed to keep society from tearing itself apart. But underneath all that regulation was something genuine, a community trying to survive, trying to make sense of a chaotic world, trying to create some semblance of order and fairness. The methods were bizarre. The enforcement was inconsistent. The punishments were often harsh. But the impulse, the desire to build something functional from chaos, that was fundamentally human. These people weren't so different from us. They wanted the same things: safety, respect, a sense of belonging, a full belly, the chance to dance, to fall in love, to feel clean. They just had to fight much harder for those things. They had to navigate impossible bureaucracies. They had to constantly look over their shoulders, wondering who was watching. They had to follow rules that seemed arbitrary and sometimes cruel. And yet, they did it. They figured out how to live in that world. They found ways to bend the rules without breaking them. They created community bonds strong enough to hold them through famines and plagues. They found joy in small moments: a good batch of salted bread, a dance in moonlight, a stolen kiss. So sleep well, medieval time traveler. You've earned your rest. You've survived the shadows of this strange world, and tomorrow, when you wake up to the morning bell, you'll have to do it all again. Another day of careful compliance, another day of walking the fine line between following the rules and finding happiness within them. That's the medieval experience. That's what it meant to live in a world where even the most mundane aspects of your life were bound up in law and tradition and the collective will of your community. It wasn't easy. It wasn't comfortable. But it was theirs. And in a strange way, we can recognize ourselves in their struggle. Because even now, we live under rules. Even now, we navigate expectations about who we should be and how we should behave. Even now, we're constantly managing the tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility. The Middle Ages just made that tension visible. They dressed it up in sumptuous laws and bread inspections and scolds' bridles. But the fundamental struggle is the same. So the next time someone tells you how great the past was, how simpler, how more authentic, remember this: you probably wouldn't survive a week in the Middle Ages. But then again, maybe they wouldn't survive now either. We're all just trying to figure it out, one strange law at a time.